and it will judge them badly if they continue on taking the fork in the road that believes that their sport is divorced from any form of moral imperative, and that their leadership should be used not just for the sport, but used as a platform to ensure that their sport can be used as a force for good. I am quite frustrated with the leadership of F1. Back in 2019, I became aware of the case of Najjar Youssef, who had been persecuted by the Bahraini government for the fact that she used Facebook to ask people to protest about human rights abuses when the race was there. Interestingly, for the first time ever, a Bahraini court made a judgment that Miss Youssef's Facebook page had been used as a reason for her to be brought before the court, i.e. directly linking it to F1. Because of that, the F1 management then agreed to meet us and actually did express concern that the court judgment of Miss Youssef's comments opposing the staging of the 2017 Formula One Grand Prix had been part of her case. It is regrettable that since then, they have taken steps back and they have refused to engage with anyone other than those who are prepared to give them money to stage races in countries such as Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, for example. Despite repeated requests, they haven't met us. And interestingly, they refuse to meet some of us because we have protested. In a democracy, it is absolutely right that people can protest outside F1's offices, and it is an absolute indication of the moral values of the leadership of F1 that they refuse to engage with people who have a different view. We would particularly like to see a number of things happen. Today, I am part of a number of MPs and peers from the British Parliament that have written an open letter to F1. And we're asking them for to do certain things. They're not extreme things, they're not radical things. They're things that we would expect any sporting organisation with any leadership that has moral leadership at its heart to openly embrace. Number one is that there is an independent inquiry into the implications of F1 races in human rights. That independent inquiry will determine whether we are right or whether they are right in terms of whether F1 does sports wash the human rights abuses of countries like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. We asked them also in there for whether their current human rights policy is effective. We are not aware of any independent review that they have allowed other than their own judging of their current human rights policy to say whether it is effective. So we would ask for an independent review to see whether it's effective. We would also ask for an independent review of the validity of their previous responses to human rights abuses linked to F1, such as the case of Miss Youssef, that they have responded in, because it appears as though they failed to accept now any link between F1 and human rights abuses, even though a court in Bahrain made that particular link. And what we also would ask is that the FIA to adopt a human rights policy that is consistent with the UN guiding principles on businesses and human rights. We believe that the fork and the steering wheel of turning down the road of a moral vacuum, or turning down the road of using F1 for good and not using them to sports wash human rights abuses, is now. We expect the leadership of F1 to respond. Human rights and F1 can go side by side. They are not things that are mutually exclusive. And it is a pity that the present leadership of the FIA and F1 seem to think that money, profit, and that their own self-importance is far more important in giving dignity and basic human rights to people in the country they may profit from. That is our ask. They now have the choice of which road to take. We are prepared to support them and help them if they'll engage with us, which they're now refusing to do so, to make the correct decision.
Thank you so much for those words, Paul. And now I'm going to hand over to Lottie, who's going to read some remarks on behalf of the yes. Okay, great.
Dear Formula One drivers, management and teams, we are writing to you as family members of 12 death row inmates who are facing imminent execution in Bahrain. We hope that during your participation in the Grand Prix, commencing in Bahrain on the 3rd of March 2023, you will use your international platforms to help save their lives. Our family members remain behind bars and at risk of execution, despite the clear injustice of their convictions. Many of them were targeted because they took part in pro-democracy protests during the Arab Spring, the 12th anniversary of which has just passed. A recent report from Human Rights Watch and the Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy investigated 8 cases of death row prisoners and found that their trials involved serious breaches under international law. As a result, our family members were sentenced to death in sham trials, based solely or primarily on confessions allegedly coerced through torture and ill treatment. The report documented that our beloveds are subjected to electrical shocks to the chest and genitals, sleep deprivation, beatings, and attempted rape. Their trials cannot be considered fair, but as our relatives have exhausted all legal remedies, they could be sent to the firing squad at any moment. We are forced to live in a permanent state of fear and panic, knowing they could be taken from us at any time. In every call we have with them, we are forced to remember that it may be our last. In 2017, when Bahrain resumed executions after a 7-year pause, we were terrified that the next to be executed would be our loved ones. This same fear struck again in 2019, when 2 more political prisoners were executed. This causes constant distress and extreme anxiety, which takes over our lives and takes a severe toll on our mental health. Interventions into human rights issues in Bahrain by F1 have been powerful in the past, and we urge drivers not to be muzzled by the FIA's frightening attempts to curb such important political action. In particular, Lewis Hamilton's March 2022 discussions with Bahraini authorities about the state of political imprisonment drew global attention to the country's human rights abuse, giving hope to our relatives and families. We were encouraged by the continued commitment of drivers to use their voices in spite of the FIA political speech ban. We echo Lewis's sentiment that sport does have a responsibility still, always, to speak out on things, to create awareness on important topics, particularly as we travel to all these different places. As the Grand Prix attracts the global gaze, what better time to call attention to the pressing issue of unjust execution of men in Bahrain? During your visit to Bahrain, we hope that you are called to abolish the death penalty and for the sentences of our family members to be commuted. We believe your intervention can help spare our loved ones' innocent lives. In 2020, King Hamad pardoned a citizen of the Philippines imprisoned in Bahrain after being killed by the Filipino president, showing that pleas from influential international figures can make all the difference. Below, we have attached a list of our family members currently suffering on death row. 3 of them have urgent medical needs, but the authorities refuse to allow us to take them to hospital for proper treatment. Just recently, Mohammed Ramadan was beaten by prison guards when he made this request. Thank you for your kind attention to these greatly important matters. Your action can make all the difference in helping to free our family members. Yours sincerely, families of death row inmates in Bahrain.
Thank you so much for those really, really powerful words, and it's been well read by you, Lottie. Thank you. So now we're going to hear from an audio recording from Ali Al-Hadi, who is currently imprisoned in Bahrain, and it's recorded a voice message.
Voicing here with my concerns. The Honourable Ladies and Gentlemen, today I'm voicing here with my concerns over rights and freedom in Bahrain. It is very unfortunate that Formula One, as well as many international events that held in Bahrain, are being employed as a cover-up for curbing freedom of speech and to wash human rights abuses. As a prisoner of conscience, I am serving a 10 years prison sentence since May 2013 for peacefully protesting in the Capital Manama. I was subjected to harsh torture, both physical and confession during was the rate for the 10 years jail sentence, similar to around 1,300 prisoners are suffering in their prison. That's their basic human rights standard. The prisoner rights have been further deterioration, maltreatment for physical hostile inflicted on prisoners, sanitation of leadership, is a condition related to physical, mental maltreatment, and combined with radiation of very essential youth surgery treatments, all that for my criticism of activities committed by authorities against prisoners. Finally, I encourage authorities to release all political prisoners immediately. Thanks, I have actually no prison February 2023.
That's a really remarkable. We've been able to get and lucky us, so it's really, really powerful to see that there.
Everyone. Around the time of the Arab Spring in 2011, the UN introduced a statement of international law, which for the first time took things beyond states in the direction of businesses and required businesses to respect human rights. The UN guiding principles mean that businesses can no longer ignore human rights in the countries in which they operate, and suggest, as Formula One has suggested in this morning's news, that they should not interfere with local affairs, that the governance of Bahrain is simply a matter for the Bahraini government, because where business activities can encourage adverse human rights impacts, then suddenly the business is going to become responsible to some extent for those human rights. Businesses like Formula One need to have a statement on their human rights position, which Formula One was pressed to do due to a complaint made to the OECD in 2014. At that time, Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain made a complaint to the OECD, and that led to some engagement with stakeholders on the ground. So it's very disappointing that at this stage, and I can confirm that a further complaint has been made, there are no signs that Formula One, since it signed a new 14-year contract with Bahrain, is engaging with stakeholders like Bird, which is the foremost organisation working on human rights in Bahrain in the UK, or other stakeholders like ADHRB. The guidelines do take into account the size and resources of the business and how much leverage it has. I don't think there's any doubt that Formula One has leverage in the Gulf and Bahrain. And I think it's important that Formula One takes note that human rights due diligence laws are now being introduced in domestic law around Europe and the world. There are human rights due diligence laws in France, Germany, Norway, Switzerland, and there will be soon in the EU. So just last week, Total, the oil company, found itself in a French court, even though it's only a minority shareholder in a company operating in Yemen. And the environment. Their subsidies. So what does that mean for Formula One? Well, what expression and freedom of assembly. Business enterprises like Lions issue. Formula One organising a sporting event in Russia, they have thought twice about organising such an event in the Gulf. All that's being asked in order to comply with the law is that an effective due diligence process takes place, that Formula One looks at its stake and finds a way of operationalising it, so it's more than simply a statement, and that they acknowledge their influence and impact on the human rights situation in Bahrain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good morning, everyone. Yesterday, Bert sent a letter to Formula One's CEO, Stefano Domenicali, raising our concerns over F1's ongoing role in sports washing the dire human rights situation in Bahrain. We are working with local and international human rights organizations to send an open letter prior to the race. F1 should understand that there is consensus position from the human rights community and a large body of evidence they chose to ignore, and how the situation is deteriorating. Since F1 returned to Bahrain after 2011 event, 11 years later, and there has been no evidence that everyone's a security that now its population at the highest rate of any estimates that close to half of Bahrain's total prison population are political prisoners. Algeris Senghis, who remain unlawful 1 year and 7 months, arbitrary confiscated research. Formula One CEO said in a recent interview with Sky Sports that he was prepared, and I quote, pull the plug on the Grand Prix. If F1 is not happy with the way that human rights have developed, and further reference, and I quote, very clear articles that if we see something that is not going in the right direction, we have immediately the benefit of stopping that relationship there are independent auditors that are following that in the quote. In our letter to Stefano, we called on F1 first is to disclose what they really mean by the very clear articles. Can they disclose those? What he exactly referring to? Since F1 continues to race in the Gulf states, we are notorious for maintaining for some of the worst human rights records on the planet. Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, which last year has carried out execution spree, as well as conducting the largest mass execution in the country's modern history of 81 people were executed in a single day. It is difficult to understand where the threshold is on human rights that would lead F1 to, as Stefano says, and I quote, pull the plug and invoke these contracted articles. With this in mind, we hope that F1 will recognize the importance of the transparency and disclose these articles to us. And however, he must be transparent and show the public what these human rights clauses and who F1's independent auditors are they have made in these countries. These are the answers that we expect F1 provide us before they stage their race in Bahrain this weekend. It has been an incredible it has been also like incredible to see true solidarity and genuine concern for victims coming from Sir Lewis Hamilton, who has been setting an example for everyone in this sport by using his brain. It is high time that F1 and Saudi Arabia to be used to spot the of these autocracies. Despite horrific human rights record, both states enjoy generous contracts and exploit the platform to their image on the world stage bars. F1 must establish an impartial
their response.
I'm from Campaign Against Arms Trade in the war in Yemen, and the impact of the sports washing that has been proven by all of the speakers that we've heard from today. So as well as the horrific internal repression, both in Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain, both of these countries have been complicit in the war in Yemen. Saudi-led coalition that began bombarding Yemen in March 2015 was also included Bahrain. So 8 years later, the war is still ongoing and has led to untold human suffering. The latest figures we have from the UN are that 377,000 people have died, including through fighting and hunger. And that figure is only up to 2021. So I think that first shows the scale of the suffering, and secondly, how state accurate figures on what's happening there, which is its own huge issue. And we know that at least 8,983 civilians have died from coalition bombardments. So that is from the Saudi-led coalition. So in 2019, a legal action by Campaign Against Arms Trade, it forced the government here in the UK to stop issuing export licenses for weapons that could be used in the war in Yemen. So this is because the UK at various times has armed up to at least half of the coalition's weapons. And from the very beginning of the war, there was outcry from international NGOs, from local NGOs, from UN bodies and panels of experts that there was potential war crimes or at the very least serious violations of international humanitarian law. The government in 2020 resumed arms sales, even though we had a successful appeal in here in the High Court, and it claimed that any violations of international humanitarian law were only isolated incidents and these did not form a pattern. The government's arguments flew in the face of all of the evidence that airstrikes had targeted civilians, and many of these showed clear patterns. In cases where such incidents have been investigated, there's been no military target nearby, and in practice, just to make this kind of more concrete, this means targeting civilian gatherings such as weddings, busy marketplaces, schools, hospitals, residential areas, as well as water facilities, water pumps at agricultural farms. So that was purposely to impact food, and all of this falls under violations of IHL. So we were actually back in the High Court this last month, January and February, challenging the government again on resuming these arms sales. I think one of the shocking kind of something that we already knew, but it was very much part of the case, again, was that the government had a tracker of hundreds of potential incidents of IHL violations. And once an incident is potential, it means it's credible. There is evidence. There's evidence that civilians have died, and yet half of these, there's no Saudi report about half of these incidents. They just say, "Oh, we don't have enough information to determine." So that's the kind of standard that we're working with. It's a really poor and I think kind of a systematic denial of the crimes that have been committed by this coalition. So, apart from the destruction and the suffering that the Yemeni people have suffered for 8 years, it'll be 8 years in March. The other impact of this war is the impunity for war crimes, impunity for IHL violations, impunity for serious violations of human rights. And I think what we're seeing, not just in the Gulf region, but now also in Europe, is that impunity spreads. We now have, we're dealing with the exact same type of war crimes in Ukraine. And this is because the international system has not held Saudi Arabia to account. It's not held the coalition, and other states know that they can get away with the exact same kind of crimes. This is why F1, FIA, all of the sports washing is so useful to these regimes. It has two clear impacts. It means that the public associates the names of these countries with prestigious and, kind of glamorous events with lots of money, famous people, Western countries and their states, and also buys the silence of these institutions, which have a moral and also, like we've heard from Sue, have a legal obligation to speak out. I think, even just to take, for instance, Saudi Arabia, the mass execution that happened where, 81 people were killed was 2 weeks before the Saudi Grand Prix, and also was just before the UK Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, took a visit to the country. So all of this goes to reinforce how Saudi and Bahrain are able to get away with these crimes. Sports brings people together, it unites people. We must not allow this solidarity to be sold to the highest bidder. Solidarity with each other and with the fans is what makes these institutions powerful, and that's what we can use to leverage for the rights of people in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and Yemen.
So much. I think there's some really powerful intervention to close out today's event. Do we have one from Haja? Yes, sorry, yeah. So just before we end, we're going to hear from Haja Mansour through Lottie.
My name is Haja Mansour. As someone who has suffered from torture and unlawful imprisonment in Bahrain, who has spent 3 years wrongfully behind bars, and whose family have faced repeated violent reprisals from the Bahraini state, I have been trying to engage with Formula One without success. Last year, along with my former cellmate, Nadia Yousset, I wrote to F1 as they staged their race in Bahrain, asking them to meet with us and work to help us to improve the human rights situation in the country. I have a son, Syed Nizar Al-Wadi, who is still imprisoned in Bahrain today, and who's been subject to deliberate denial of medical treatment by authorities. My son was arrested and tortured when he was just 18 years old, and is now imprisoned, serving an 11-year sentence in the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. They called that an act of reprisal for my son-in-law's human rights activism in the UK. They urged Bahrain to abide by international law by releasing him and providing him with compensation. Despite this, my son remains behind bars in jail prison, where he is suffering from systematic medical negligence. He is currently not being given any treatment for problems in his eye and a severe headache that he has been complaining about for several weeks. Currently, he is facing psychological torture as prison authorities lock him and other prisoners in their cells 23 hours a day, leaving them with only 1 hour a day to exercise and communicate with their families. They are forced to sit in squalor in their cells almost for every hour of the day. It is hard to imagine the devastating damage this near constant confinement has had on my son, after his mental health has already been decimated by torture and years of mistreatment and wrongful imprisonment. Every day that passes, my family and I are living in anguish, worrying about his well-being and waiting for the day that he will be released. Formula One claims to care about human rights and that their sport spotlights rights issues in the countries where they race. These claims are not only meaningless, but are an insult to victims of human rights abuse. Unless Formula One makes direct representations to their business partners, the improvement of human rights, and the release of my son, Syed Nizar, and all other political prisoners in Bahrain.
So much for that. And that brings us to a close of Hubert's remarks. And now we're going to open the floor to questions for any of today's speakers that are in the
Since the last two races in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, the big change has been the FIA's move to limit what drivers can say and what the statements and the political views. What would you like to see in practical terms the drivers do as compared to Bahrain in the subsequent race in Saudi Arabia? Would you like them to make statements, or how would you like them to respond?
I don't think it's for us to tell the drivers what they must say or mustn't say, but what I think is important that both F1 and the FIA set a framework where drivers are free to say what they wish to highlight the issues. And if I can use the words of Lewis Hamilton in 2021, what he said, I think is very powerful, is, quote, "I do not think we should just be going to these countries and just ignoring what is happening in those places. Arriving, having a great time, and then leaving," end of quote. So I think a framework needs to be set where drivers can go, show that they're not ignoring, showing that they are raising either individual cases or general views about human rights abuses, and basically doing what I think most of the drivers and most of the fans want, and that is using the sport, not just for sport, but actually as a force for good, so that it's not just money that's made, but it's real change that's made in those countries. And I think that will be the lasting legacy of F1 and Grand Prix if the FIA and F1 put in place a framework which gives the freedom for drivers to go and speak out and highlight cases.
sorts of message do you think it would send out if saying, just following on from those comments from Lewis, that he said there was a race in Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, and then perhaps boycotting it to way more? Do you think that would show what sort of message?
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because clearly there is a advantage of races taking place there, that it does highlight and spotlight, but it can't be, as I said, within a moral vacuum. So I think that Lewis and others would be correct to say, unless F1 and the FIA put in place a framework which is in line with the UN Charter of Business Responsibility and Human Rights, unless that happens, then I think that I and other drivers would feel uncomfortable about racing there, and potentially, unless that is put in place, we would seek not to race there. So I think they could put pressure both in terms of highlighting, but as well as getting the dinosaurs of managers and administrators of their sport to actually put in place the correct framework, which means it isn't just individual cases, but there's a systematic legal approach to how F1 and the FIA decide where to race. And I think that would be a real positive force. So I think, you know, I'm a liberal by nature. I don't like bans. So I think a framework, but I think if that's not put in place, then I think Lewis Hamilton and other drivers would have a case to say, if you're not prepared to do that, then we're not prepared to go and race there. We want to race in an ethical framework.
Did you want to comment?
Yes, of course. So the drivers will be, as you heard, there will be an approach from the family. Those which many of them, the UN, for instance, had looked into some of those cases and say there are clear breaches into international law in these cases, and they urge the government of Bahrain to release them. This is a direct appeal from the families for the drivers to speak out, to make a use of their platforms. I also feel like this year there will be individuals which will be reaching out to Lewis Hamilton through social media. I'm aware of this is the child of Ahmad Ramadan, the child of Muhammad Ramadan, who also sits on this row, is planning this year to draw Lewis Hamilton's new Mercedes car. And obviously this will come with a message. So I would really encourage journalists, when you are in Bahrain, to ask Lewis directly whether you've seen this stuff and what his response to them. This would be really extremely important. So I think it's a matter that when journalists start asking the drivers about those important questions, and I mean, for instance, there is a very clear example on FIA recently when they issued the ban. I think one thing dominated the recent cars releases was one of the drivers being asked about what you're going to do about the FIA ban, and I think it was really interesting. If not all the drivers were very clear against it, and some of them really clearly would say we would defy the rules, and we heard some very interesting comments. So I think we would like to share those letters in advance, so drivers are well aware of these. We will be sharing these also with teams. Comment which I wanted to make is we've seen a clear contrast between how drivers are reacting and how Formula One management and what sides they are taking. Because I think for F1, just to tell us that we do not want to even acknowledge your concern, we do not want to hear or respond to torture victims, and we have a clear human rights policy. Are too inconvenient for you, then what is really the true value of your human rights policy? Thank you. Any further questions?
Yeah, ask about what the British government can help, what can do with this.
Well, clearly I'm not a spokesperson for the British government, so
It's not called.
I think my call to the British government is to think very carefully about how they're also investing in some of these states. So there's a thing called the Gulf Strategy Fund, which is a fund which the British taxpayer pay to train security forces, for example, such as in Down Jail, where we just heard one of the inmates. So I would say to them, be very aware that when you are investing in these countries to try to improve security for monsters, if things are not getting better, all you do is allow people like F1 to cite the British government. So I would ask them to be more vigilant on that, and particularly for British drivers who are driving there, support their right to the UK and make very clear representations to the Bahraini authorities that they would take it very seriously if any British driver was stopped from speaking out about issues that were happening in countries like Bahrain or Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much, Bob.
And the World Cup, how it's been politicized somehow with the voices rising for the LGBTQ's rights and stuff like that. But when it comes to certain countries, it looks like the politicians or the campaigners from behind the hidden hands, if we can call them, can actually push for a campaign against certain countries. Or like, for instance, when it comes to Formula One now, because there isn't a mainstream media campaign here for the human rights in Bahrain, calling for change and respect for human rights to put it as a priority when they come and Grand Prix in Bahrain or Saudi Arabia.
I think you started on a very important point. What I hear is keep politics out of sport. It's a political decision. Where there is human rights, an independent review of the human rights policy. It's a political decision to allow your organisation to be used as a grandstanding, glamour, glitzy event, which hides what's really happening. So I think the issue, not just for politicians, but for drivers, fans, and for the managers and administrators of these sports, it doesn't matter what the country is. If human rights abuses are taking place, it comes back to what Sue said. You have to have an internationally agreed framework which protects human rights, and that you make an informed decision, a political decision, small thing, about whether your organisation is prepared to take multi-million pounds off that government to stage your event. And I think that's the important thing. So I think forget the country. Ultimately, I mean, we're focusing on Bahrain because that's where the first race is, the 13-year contract just being done. But I think if the framework is correct, protect human rights and understand your role in that as an organisation, then a sporting organisation, then I think it helps. And I think sometimes it does detract that it's about country rather than across the region or across the world. We expect international norms to be upheld. If you're going to race there, kick a football there, or throw a rugby ball there, or whatever it may be.
I'll just ask one more. We obviously heard from the political prisoners in Bahrain and their families. And also, you spoke about the mass executions before the last race in Saudi Arabia. I mean, Stefano Domenicali says about pulling the plug if you can't see an improved human rights situation in these countries. You know, should Formula One be racing there at all?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is the question which we posed to Formula One. What could it be worse than a country execute a human later on, we know that those executions were unlawful. Those were deliberate act of the states held with a stroke of a pen will destroy the opponents of the government and insulting and humiliating from violence. Alarm and then saying, but you know, there would be, we begins to see young women, young people are engaged in this sport, and I believe in the power of sports. This is so much humiliating to those who just lost their beloved. How could you say this? How could you deal with them and just like be alarmed at the same time, take your defense as a PR mouthpiece on behalf of the Bahraini regime to defend your race? And then if you say to us, oh, there is an audit, like there are independent auditors in place to review, I ask, like, what worse than this? And then at the same time is when Formula One and FIA took the decision to withdraw from Russia because Russia staged the war in Ukraine. Saudi Arabia at that time was awarded a new contract. Why they were already initiating war, like they waged the war in Yemen since 2015. And there were international documentation that war crimes were committed there by the Saudi. Then it was a political decision that they made to race in Saudi Arabia. It is also a political decision for them to ignore human rights in Bahrain. And to them, it's just to say, we're not going to engage with you at all. We're not even going to acknowledge your concerns. This really tells you about and then they reward the country with 15 years contract. To my knowledge, this is the longest contract that it was a clear signal. They ended. This is how they. If we give them cash, and if we give them millions in cash, then we buy their silence. We buy not only their silence, we buy their side as well. I think even in Saudi Arabia, also when Stefano was asked, obviously he became a political commentator and began to say like how there is a difference between when a state is attacked. So this is really the sort of things which we are doing, and I think this is how Saudi Arabia and Bahrain will do when they are really up for sale, and they will race in the country at any cost.
And I would just add, I don't think it's for me as a British politician to lead the kind of should we pull out. Listen to everybody who's in Bahrain, either the issues that be read out or RG in jail. They've asked for engagement. They've asked for engagement. They've asked for F1 to use the race as a form of engagement and highlighting issues. That's where we are. But as I've said at the beginning, we're at a fork. If they don't engage and they don't change, then I do believe eventually those voices from Bahrain will say, it's not working. You're not improving human rights. It's time for a ban. So it's down to the leadership. If they want to continue racing there, to take heed of what people who are in prison say and what the people who are in those countries advocating, which at the moment is engagement and change. If not, my guess is at some point, if they continue on that fork in the road of the moral vacuum, there will probably be a call for a ban. But at the moment, it's engage, speak out, and help be a positive force for change.
Thank you very much. Any final questions? Or I think we're going
Like to take it on camera.
It depends whether anyone's coming in. I'm just aware that they might be kicked out. We'll do what we can. We may have to continue outside. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. And it's been a really fantastic event. All speakers.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to get it.